So, we've just touched upon the Pyrrhonian tradition's symbols, and now we delve into a key figure within that tradition, Aeneasidemus. Think of him as the OG skeptic, the one who really got the ball rolling for the movement that Sextus Empiricus later championed. Now, Sextus himself wrote extensively against physicists. Imagine him as the ultimate academic referee, constantly calling fouls on various physical theories. And his teacher, Timon, apparently had a similar book titled Against the Physicists. While Timon's main focus, according to Sextus, was about the tricky business of starting arguments from hypotheses, which is a bit meta even for Pyrrhonism, there's no doubt he dabbled in physics. He even made some bold claims about processes and time that might suggest he wasn't just parroting his master Pyrrho, perhaps even taking a different path. This sets the stage perfectly for Anaxidemus. As the founder of this skeptical school, wouldn't it be surprising if he completely ignored the big questions of physics? Of course not, but what would he do? Well, given his skeptical bent, his goal wouldn't be to build his own physics empire. It would be to dismantle the castles in the air built by others. To sow doubt, to make people question their confidence in established physical theories. Okay, so how do we know Anaxidemus was actually doing this anti-physicist dig? We don't have a smoking gun like Timon's against the physicists. But here's where things get interesting. Sextus attributes a set of 8 modes specifically to Anaxidemus, and these guys are laser-focused on tearing down ideologia, causal explanation. Think about it. Causation is pretty fundamental to physics, right? Both the Stoics and Sextus himself put it squarely under the physics umbrella. So, if Anaxidemus is going after causality in physics, he's definitely in the ring. Then we have Photius, that Byzantine scholar, giving us a peek into Anaxidemus' Pyrrhonist discourses. Photius basically says, hey, Anaxidemus spent a lot of time kicking the tires on physics. Books 2 through 5, according to Photius, were all about physical topics. We're talking causes, effects, motion, birth, death, and their opposites. Book 3 doubles down on motion, and Book 4 even touches on signs, which could be used in physical inquiry, plus mentions hitting those classic impasses about nature, the universe, and the gods. And Book 5? Back to causes, attacking those who try to explain things through atia. It seems clear, even without a dedicated against the physicists, that Anaxidemus was deeply involved in critiquing physical thought. Sextus doesn't stop there. He sprinkles other hints about Anaxidemus's engagement with physics throughout his work. There's this cryptic phrase, Anaxidemus in accordance with Heraclitus, popping up in a few places. What does that mean? Scholars scratch their heads over this one. But then, more concretely, Sextus mentions an argument Anaxidemus apparently used to conclude, nothing is a cause. Wow, that's a direct hit at the heart of physics. And he also notes Anaxidemus made a distinction between types of motion, likely to poke holes in other philosophers' theories. So the picture is building. Anaxidemus was definitely wrestling with physics. But what about space or place? Did he tackle that specifically? We don't have a direct quote saying Anaxidemus argued X about place. But hold on, we know he talked about motion, and motion and place are practically inseparable concepts. If something moves, it must move somewhere, right? Sextus himself often groups them together. Given that Anaxidemus even distinguished a type of motion called transitional motion, basically moving from one place to another, it's almost impossible to imagine him discussing motion without eventually bumping into the concept of place itself. The connection seems too strong to ignore. Now, let's zoom in on one specific mode that seems particularly relevant to our discussion of place. One of the 10 modes, which we'll get to shortly, deals with positions, intervals, and places. This sounds exactly like the kind of stuff we're interested in. Now, who gets credit for these 10 modes? Usually it's Anaxidemus, though not necessarily as the inventor. Think of him as the editor-in-chief who compiled existing skeptical material into a powerful systematic toolkit. But some scholars have recently questioned this attribution. Fair enough. Let's look at the evidence. Sextus initially calls them the older skeptics' modes, which isn't super helpful. But then, in a different work, Against the Logicians, he refers to the 10 modes of Anaxidemus. Karol Janček suggested this might point to a lost introductory section of Sextus's larger work, where he presented the modes earlier. Plus, we have Aristocles of Messene, writing much closer to Anaxidemus's time, mentioning 9 modes, including one based on distances, sizes, and motions. That sounds suspiciously like our place mode. Even if Aristocles only counted 9, the content strongly suggests he's referring to the same core material. So, while debates can continue, the weight of evidence still points firmly towards Anisidormus as the compiler, or at least the most prominent figure associated with these 10 modes. David Sedley adds another fascinating layer. Diogenes Laertius, when listing the modes, notes that different authors ordered them differently. Specifically, he says, the 9th in my list Sextus and Anisidormus put 10th, and the 10th Sextus says is 8th. Wait a minute. In Diogenes' list, the 9th mode is the one about relativity, and Sextus's 9th mode is also the relativity mode. So how can Sextus and Anisidormus put the 9th mode 10th? Unless Diogenes is referring to a different arrangement of modes that Sextus used elsewhere, perhaps in that lost general introduction we mentioned. This suggests Sextus might have originally followed Anisidormus's ordering more closely than in the PH1 version we have. Now, besides the order, there's a slight difference in terminology between Sextus and Diogenes for this particular mode. Sextus uses diastemmata, intervals, while Diogenes uses apostasies. Philo of Alexandria, an earlier source, uses Sextus's terms. Aristocles uses apostemmata, another form of distance. Does this tiny word choice matter philosophically, or is it just a minor variation? Annis and Barnes argue that Diogenes' use of apostasies, distances, is slightly inaccurate because one of Sextus's examples involves viewing a colonnade from different angles, not just different distances. They say Sextus emphasizes the symmetry versus tapering effect due to the angle. Okay, fair point. The example does involve both distance and angle. But let's dig deeper. Diastemmata, interval, generally means the extent by which things stand apart. It can be non-spatial like musical intervals, but it still implies some kind of gap. Angles or directions don't really create such a gap in the same way distance does. So, if the key aspect Sextus highlights is the change in appearance due to angle, maybe that example doesn't fit neatly under diastemmata. Perhaps it belongs under topos, places. If that's the case, then maybe Sextus, not Diogenes, is being slightly inaccurate by grouping it under intervals. Ultimately, whether you prefer diastemmata or apostasy, the core idea seems to be about physical separation or relation. For the purposes of understanding Anisidormus's original intent, this terminological quibble might not be the most crucial takeaway. So, aside from the word choice, how are the examples organized? Sextus presents them quite systematically. First, things appearing different from different distances, then different places, then different positions. Diogenes starts a bit more broadly, listing general ways things appear differently, big, small, square, round, etc., before getting into specific examples. But once Diogenes gets to his specific cases, the order mirrors Sextus's: distance, then place, then position. And crucially, many of the examples overlap. The bent oar, the tower looking round far away and square close up, the picture appearing flat or 3D depending on its orientation, the dove's neck changing color. These are the kinds of examples that likely formed the core of the original mode. Philo even includes the oar example. So, we can reasonably reconstruct the flavor of the examples Anisidormus probably used. Everyday observation showing how the same object looks different under varying conditions of distance, place, or position. Now, here's the million-dollar question. How does this collection of examples lead to skepticism? Think about how earlier thinkers used similar phenomena. Plato talks about the bent oar in the Republic to show how our senses can deceive us, but he assumes we know the real shape of the oar. The Epicureans had their theory about atomic images explaining why the tower looked round or square. Philo also uses these examples to illustrate how we can be misled, assuming we know the truth. The key difference with Sextus and Diogenes is their approach. They present all appearances as equally valid. They just appear different. No appearance is privileged as the true one. And then comes the punchline. Because we only ever perceive things in some place, at some interval, from some position, and each of these creates variation in appearance, we cannot possibly know the thing's nature, its ousia. Diogenes puts it bluntly: since we can't perceive things apart from these conditions, their nature is unknown. Sextus echoes this, concluding we can describe appearances, but cannot reveal what things are like in their nature. The shift is from explaining deception to questioning the possibility of knowing reality itself. How does Sextus bridge that gap between observing things in conditions and concluding we can't know their nature? He inserts a little argument. He imagines someone trying to say, okay, sure, appearances vary, but some of them must show us the real thing. Against this, Sextus argues, if you claim some appearances are true without proof, why should I believe you? If you offer proof, whose proof is correct? And whose proof of that proof is correct? Boom, infinite regress. Or he could use hypothesis. Assume appearances reflect reality, and you quickly run into contradictions. Now, here's the kicker. These kinds of arguments, hypothesis, infinite regress, are typically grouped with the five modes, which Sextus attributes to later skeptics. This suggests Sextus himself added this argumentative bridge to the 10 modes. Diogenes, in his version, doesn't include this explicit argument. This raises a fascinating possibility. Maybe Anisidormus's original reasoning was simpler, more focused on the restrictedness of experience, and this more complex argument was a later development layered onto the mode. Let's explore that alternative interpretation further. Why focus so much on the fact that appearances are restricted to specific places, positions, or intervals? Maybe the core issue isn't the conflict between appearances, but the limitation imposed by these conditions. Think about it. What would we mean by the nature of a thing? Probably its essential characteristics, independent of any particular circumstance. If a feature only appears when the object is in a specific place or from a specific angle, can that feature truly belong to the object's nature? Take the egg soft inside the bird, hard outside. Since softness is tied to being inside, and hardness to being outside, neither quality seems essential to the egg itself. It's like saying the egg's texture is always conditional. If we apply this logic broadly, any observable feature that only appears under certain conditions might not give us access to the thing's unconditioned nature. The problem isn't choosing between conflicting views, it's recognizing that all our views are filtered through specific conditions. Let's apply this restrictedness idea to the examples. The egg soft inside, hard outside. Because softness is place-bound, and hardness is too, neither tells us about the egg's essential nature. Same with the oar, straight in air, bent in water. Straightness is air-bound, bentness is water-bound. Neither reveals the oar's nature. The sun-changing appearance across the sky. Each look is tied to a specific position. The dove's neck changing color. Color tied to orientation. Notice how this resonates with Plato's Republic. Socrates argues that nothing in the sensible world is truly beautiful, or just because its goodness or beauty only appears under certain conditions. Sensible qualities are merely apparent. This restrictedness interpretation offers a way to understand the skeptical conclusion without necessarily relying on the more complex arguments borrowed from the five modes. It focuses on the inherent limitation of our access to the unconditioned nature of things due to the conditions of our perception. Is this restrictedness idea just a special case for this one mode? Not really. Similar themes pop up elsewhere in Sextus's 10 modes, contrasting our awareness of things in conditions with their nature or bare reality. And interestingly, a similar argument appears in Sextus's Against the Ethicists. We can't know good or evil by nature because we only experience them in relation to specific circumstances. If we accept this broader pattern, maybe Anisidormus's approach, as reflected in this mode, was fundamentally about showing how the very structure of our experience, mediated by place, position, and interval, blocks our path to understanding the nature of things. This doesn't mean the mode itself gets bogged down in physical theories, but it could easily become the starting point for a deeper debate. A physicist might say, "Look, my theory explains the bent oar perfectly." The skeptic could respond, "Your theory explains the appearance in water. Yes, but does it tell us the nature of the oar, independent of water? And how do you know your theory captures that nature, given the limitations we've just discussed?" The mode could thus serve as a springboard into fundamental questions about the nature of scientific knowledge and explanation. So, wrapping up our look at Anisidormus as an anti-physicist, the evidence strongly suggests he wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. He actively engaged with physics, primarily by undermining confidence in physical theories, especially those claiming to explain causality. His methods were skeptical, aiming to create doubt rather than build positive systems. The mode concerning place, position, and interval is a prime example of his strategy. Whether interpreted through the lens of conflicting appearances or restricted appearances, it powerfully illustrates how the conditions of our experience fundamentally limit our ability to grasp the nature of reality. This critical stance, this focus on exposing the limits of knowledge, is central to understanding Anisidormus's role in the skeptical tradition and his enduring challenge to those who claim definitive knowledge about the physical world.